Hello, welcome to the next video. In this video, we're going to talk about Python file access. File access is a very important capability in any programming language. To open a file in Python, or for reading or writing to, the function or method you want to call is open. Okay, so we would just call open here, and I'm passing in the name of a file that I want to open, and then when I'm done with the file, I always want to close the file. Okay, so this isn't going to do anything because we're not actually reading anything from the file, but if we run it, if the file exists and we can open and close it, we won't get any errors. Okay, let's look at the next example and do something a bit more interesting with our file. Okay, so here we're using the open method. We're opening a file for reading that file, and notice we're passing in RT here. What are these arguments? Okay, so T, it's text by default, or B for binary, R is for read, A for append, W for write, X for create. We can pass these options in to the open method, and if it's a file that I don't want to write to, I can use the R method. It's read only. If it's a file I need to write to, I can use the W, and it will create a file if it does not exist. If I want to be careful not to delete or erase a file and create it from scratch every time I write to it, if I want to keep appending data to it like a log file, then I would use the A option. So just be aware, append, write, create, read, the different arguments and options that we pass in here and here. Okay? And in this example, once we get our file open, if we successfully connect to the file and we open it and everything's okay, there's no errors, then I would call the read method on the file. The file is my handle, sort of my instance of the object that's created when open successfully loads the file. And so if I call the read method on it, then I can display the contents of that file. And let's do that. All right, we're going to call function 2. I'm going to hit F5. And it's just one of my favorite Don McLean songs, American Pie. But it just displays, and in the streets the children screamed, the lovers cried and the poets dreamed, but not a word was spoken, the church bells all were broken. And the three men I admire the most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, they caught the last train for the coast the day the music died. And they were singing, bye bye Miss American Pie, drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. Them good old boys were drinking whiskey and rye, singing, this'll be the day that I die. This will be the day that I die. And it's just reading that text from this file here. Just a plain ASCII text file that we have, and I'll drag it over here. So you can see, it reads that file sequentially, each line of text in that file. And let's look at our third option. And in this case, read, and we're passing in an argument. So read with nothing, it read the contents of the entire file. But what if we just want to read 5 characters? Here with no arguments, it read the entire file. What happens when we pass in 5 number of characters? I'll hit F5, we'll run it. And I, right? Let's count the characters in the file. I'll open that text file again. So I'll move the cursor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you see, these are the first 5 characters in the file sequentially, and it read that and displayed that here. Okay. In addition to read by itself, which reads the entire file, read with an argument passed in as a parameter, which can read a number of characters in a file. One of our third options here is read line, just to read a single line of text from the file. So I'm going to hit F5 and run it. And in the streets, the children screamed. And again, look at the file. That's just this whole first line of text here. So read line gives us, reads our text one line at a time from the file. And again, the option here, right, it's for read only, and T for text, not B for binary. Those are our options. Let's look at our next method. So far we've got read with an argument for the number of characters, and readline for a line. Let's look at function number 5 and see what's going on. Okay. 2 lines of a file. And in the streets, the children screamed, the lovers cried, and the poets dreamed. Okay. And it's adding that extra space here, but if I wanted to shave that off, and actually I'm going to do this. I'm going to modify this a little bit. Let's add a line up here. And let's not add a line here. And that just changes the formatting. So that way print won't utilize the default method of adding a line. Okay, and we'll run it. And in the streets, the children screamed, the lovers cried, and the poets dreamed. And again, let's take a look at the file. And those are the first 2 lines of that part of the file, right? From our Don McLean song. In this next example, we're going to read from a file using a for loop. We could do that line by line. So for x in the file, for the number of lines in the file, if we run this method, and again, here's the lyrics of our song, as it iterates through the for loop, x is just line by line of each text, and then we're not adding a line. If I didn't add this little extra bit of formatting here, just to show you what this would look like, I'll run it. Then the print method would add, spacing there. So that's just a little bit of extra formatting. I'll run it again. And there are the lyrics to our Don McLean song, American Pie. Here we're just going to use readline, and I'm just reviewing close. In all of these examples, notice that I open the file and then I close it. And that's just always a good idea. Once you've read from the file or loaded it into a string or an array or some object, it's a good idea to close it. And that way, something happens and the computer crashes or you lost power, you wouldn't corrupt the data in the file. So you don't want to forget to call the close method every time you call the open method. But that's just a review and just to show you what's happening. We read a single line and we close the file. Okay. Now in this next method, we're going to use OS, and notice I had to import OS here. So I have to import a module, the OS module, and then OS get CWD, that's short for get current working directory. Okay, sort of like in Linux, right? But in this case, I want to get current dir. This is useful when you need to load files and objects from the relative path from the directory within which a script is running. So you might not know until runtime what the directory structure is going to be, how the end user is going to unpack your project, or where they're going to place the directories and files. So this gives you a relative way of determining where the script is running from, and then you can use that as a path to load different files and things. So again, we're just going to get the current working directory, we'll assign it to current directory, we'll display it, and then we'll read the contents of the file again. So let's go run this method. Let me scroll back up here. And hit F5. All right, so notice that the directory the script is running in this case, it's on partition D, videos _ 1 byte at a time, Python _ programming new _ code. And then I could use that and pass that to different parts of my script to load other bits of data and other scripts and modules and things relative to the current temporary path that script is running in. So just showing you the functionality of get current working directory, a very useful method, and we just need to import OS for that. And I open the file after I list directory contents, and I just go through and display the contents of the file again. And then remember, we need to close it. Always want to close it, okay? Let me clear the console here, and we'll look at read example. Let me pull this down to give us a bit more screen real estate here. Okay, this is listing files in a directory. In addition to being able to print the current working directory, another useful thing you can do if you import the OS module, we can list the directory, okay, so where the current script is running. And I have a couple of projects, Friends Database and RPG game and other projects that you can do to get some practice with this, okay, where you'll list game files of a particular extension to your game and then allow the player to select the game file and load it. And that's just using these methods here, get the current working directory and list directory. So we want to do that, and then we're going to, basically we have a for loop, right? We're going to go through an array of all the files in the directory, and then we're going to, and again, remember we can also do this if we want to. Just a shorthand method of doing that, but we add 1 to the file counter. And what are we going to do? We're just going to add that number and then dot and number and then list the files. So let's run it. I'll hit F5 and I'll show you. All right. So we're listing all the contents of the files in that directory. And I'm going to bring up the directory over here. See, here's my directory. And in this case, right, remaining PyCache, there's 2 directories, and then here's 2 text files, and the rest are Py files. All right. So this listdir method here that I get from the OS module, very useful for listing files in a directory. And I'm just enumerating them in a for loop. Now, in this next example, let's look at, okay, this lists everything, right? It lists directories, it lists text files, right here, it lists Py files. What if we only wanted files of a particular type, of a particular extension? Well, we can do that. We would use the same for loop structure, right? We would call listdir, assign it to, in this case, an object. It's a list, it's an array type iterable object. Then we can plug it into a for loop for x for each element in that list and that array of files. But instead of displaying everything as we did up here and just numerically counting, indexing it, we have a decision structure, if, only if x, and then ends with, the special method ends with. And then here we can specify a file extension, whatever we want. So in this case, Py. Then and only then do I want to count the file and give it a number and display it, okay? So again, we'll clear the console. F5, let's run it. Oh, my bad. We're not running function 10, we're running function 9. Let me uncomment and run function 10. It helps if we run the right function, right? Okay, so now we're going to do a bit of masking or validation here a bit. So with our endswith method, F5 will run it again. So now it's filtered. Notice the directories are gone, and notice that the plain text files are gone. The only files it's listing are the files with the .py extension, and that's what we want. So another very useful method. Get all this from the OS module, importing the OS module. And remember, we can get the current working directory, very useful method. We can list the directory contents, get everything, all the files and the folders, very useful method. And we can filter or mask the files that we display to files of a certain extension with endswith. So we've looked at different ways of reading from a file, reading line by line, read line, using a for loop to iterate through each element line by line. We looked at reading characters by passing arguments into read, or reading the entire file with read with no parameters. Just different ways of reading from a file, things we can do. We imported the OS module. We look at getting the current working directory and listing directory contents and then filtering directory contents to a certain extension. So that was all reading from files and listing directory contents. Let's look at writing to a file, okay? So in this first example, we have a string here, and it's like 4 lines from Don McLean's song American Pie. And we're just concatenating the string here, and then we want to write that string to the file. Well, we have to open the file, okay, and we're passing in W, and W will overwrite any existing content. So if the file exists, it's going to overwrite it. It's not going to append to it. And if it doesn't exist, it'll create the file, okay? So we want to open it, and then we're going to write the message to it, and then we're going to close it, okay? And then here I'm just opening and reading from the file line by line and closing the file again to see its contents. But to show you, okay, so there's no text file here, right? I've deleted the text file that it created. And let's run this method. I'll try to pull this down here. Okay. There. Try to get everything on the screen at one time. All right, so there's the method. And let's run this the first time. And again, look, there's no file here, right? There's no Python 36 file access, my data file write text. So let's run it the first time and see what happens. See, it created the file. It created the file, and it wrote these 4 lines from Don McLean's song to the file. And then it just displayed the file contents here. Later down here we load it using our for loop as we did before and display the file's contents. What if the file existed, but it just had some other value in it? All right, so blah, 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 and we'll save this. So that's the contents of our file, right? Well, because we're using this option here, W, instead of append, it's going to overwrite any existing content. So if the file doesn't exist, W creates it. If the file does exist and there's data in it, it completely erases all the data and writes fresh data to the file. Sometimes that's what you want, but not always. So let's see what happens to our blah, blah, blah. We run the function again. Our blah, blah, blah was obliterated. It was gone, see? There's no blah, blah, blah there. It was obliterated because we used the W option, all right? Now, what if, on the other hand, you see this A option? What if we use append? And I'm going to erase the contents of our file. I'm going to add blah, blah, blah to it. We'll save it, right? So the contents are just blah, blah, blah. This time, instead of the W option, we're using the A option, not to write over and erase existing data, but to retain existing data and just append new data to it after that line, whatever the last line of the data is. So if I were to run this again, let me clear the console, hit F5. Notice blah, blah, blah. And as I watched him on that stage, so again, it just appended it to the file, okay? And I didn't add a carriage return and line feed, so it just put it all on the same line. But that's how we retain data. That's how we append data, using the A option instead of W. And again, here we're just appending data. So actually, let me run my first function again. So we'll have a whole measure here. I want to run a complete measure. Going to go back up here. And instead of A, let's change that to W So that way we'll write over and clear the contents of the file. And now it's just those first 4 lines from Don McLean's song, okay? So that's all that's in the file. We overwrote blah, 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 because we're not using the A option, we're using W. But let's run the next method. And then write O2 here. We're going to write 4 more lines from the song, and we want to append them. All right, so we're using the A option instead of W. So it's not going to replace or overwrite what is in this text file. It's going to append it. Okay, so let's see what happens when we run the second method. And again, down here, we're just reading the contents of the file. I'm going to clear the console, hit F5. And now look, instead of 4, we have, 8 lines from our song, from our Don McLean song, because we appended the A option instead of the W option. Here's our text file, see? And then again, we always just want to be sure that we close the file. Notice I'm doing that, but yeah, you could keep a file open and hopefully nothing goes wrong, but it's a good idea to close the file. As soon as you're done reading from it and writing to it, close it. Then if something happens, a program crashes, a power outage, and you're not connected to a UPS, or, God forbid you have corrupt data. So just good practice. Always call the close method when you're done with the file. And typically, I'd open the file, read its contents into maybe a list or an array or a string, and then manipulate that and close the file, and then keep that string open. And then again, if something bad happens, well, it happens to the string, not to the file in terms of corrupting data. So it makes things recoverable if you just close that file as soon as you're done with it. Okay, now last but not least, what if you want to just delete a file? All right, so we'll look at removing a file. And again, we're going to import the OS module. And when we import the OS module, it's just this method remove, and then the name of the text file. Okay? So let's do that. This text file exists, right? See, right, .txt. So I'm going to hit, actually, let me clear the console here. I'm going to hit F5, and let's go call the remove method and see what happens. See, it deleted that file just by calling the remove method. And then last but not least, in this method, what if you want to check and see whether or not a file exists? Well, in this case, path.exists is provided by the OS module. And with that, you can say, well, if it exists, then remove it. But if it doesn't exist, if it's already been deleted, then you can do something else, display an error message or whatever. I'm going to Control-Z and bring that file back from the dead. And let's go down here and run this last method here. All right, so the first time the file exists right now, and it should find the file. So let's run it. But it existed, it deleted it, right? So now the file's not there anymore. So the first time path.exists returned true, and so it deleted it. The next time we run the same function, path.exists is going to return false, and so the else should execute. It should say, hey, this file doesn't exist, pal. Hit F5, let's run it. And there you go. This file does not exist. So, I mean, there is a lot more to file access with Python, and we'll have future videos that cover other things regarding different types of file access and, CSV files and plain text files and binary files and databases. But this will get you going with several projects that I've already posted. The role-playing game for creating a save game file and saving your character files. The simple CSV and friends database project where you just basically create an address book to hold your contacts and friends and things like that. So this will get you going very quickly with basic file access in Python. And you can do a lot with just a little using Python file access tools, the OS module. and just the built-in file handling functionality and capability in the Python language. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it wasn't too long. If you did, please click subscribe and hit the notification bell, and then the next time I upload another video, you'll receive a notification. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you once again in the next video. Bye.